I'm going to start out with a recap of what led to this video. The Christian YouTuber Epydemic2020 made a video called The Problem of Evil. Is it a problem? And he listed 9 arguments, which I have in the description box, for why evil and suffering can be compatible with an omnipotent and benign creator. And I then made a video response called Christians Can Provide Answers to the Problem of Suffering, but the answers are unconvincing. And my point was that many of the world's mythologies contain stories about how the existence of suffering is compatible with their notion of the supernatural world. But whether it's the ancient Greeks telling us that we suffer because the gods are angry that humans stole fire, or it's the ancient Hebrews telling us that we suffer because the gods are angry that humans stole fruit from a magic tree, well, these are all just explanatory myths, stories that may be creative and entertaining, but there's no reason to believe that any of them have anything to do with the real world. Now, Epydemic, in turn, made a very articulate video response to me called Atheistic Questions, Theistic Answers, Agnostic Conclusions. And he said that his 9 explanations for suffering were not meant to prove the reality of the Christian God. He said he believed in Christianity for completely different reasons. All he was doing was refuting the argument that the existence of suffering makes the Christian notion of God impossible, or even improbable. So I'll start out this video by saying, yes, I agree that the problem of suffering certainly does not make the Christian notion of God impossible. But that's almost a non-issue, because I feel it's fairly well established that when it comes to the invisible supernatural world, you can pretty much never prove that something doesn't exist. So of course the problem of suffering would be no exception. We can't use any argument to absolutely disprove the Christian notion of God, just as we can't absolutely disprove what Islam tells us about Allah, or what the Aztecs told us about the gods that demanded human sacrifice. And we can't even absolutely disprove the invisible pink unicorn. All we can do is say that there's no evidence to believe in any of these supernatural claims, and we can use logic and evidence to show why such claims are highly improbable. Now, as for Epydemic's claim that his 9 reasons refute the argument that the problem of suffering makes the Christian notion of God improbable, he seems to mainly lean on the argument that the mind of man is finite and we cannot comprehend the infinite. And he says if we can't comprehend the infinite, he says the honest answer is to say, I can't understand why God permits suffering, rather than saying, suffering makes the existence of the Christian notion of God improbable. Now, I'll get to what I see as problems with this argument. But before I go any further, I just want to note that Epydemic uses the word God as synonymous with the Christian notion of God. And I think that's fine for his videos because he is Christian, so I think everyone knows what he's talking about when he says the word God. But for my videos, I always have to make the distinction between the Christian notion of God and the bare bones definition of God as simply a creator. And I especially need to make this distinction when it comes to discussing the problem of suffering, because I think the problem of suffering is not at all a problem when the word God means nothing more than a creator. Because the 2 main arguments for the existence of there being some type of creator are the first cause argument and the design argument. And neither of these arguments, at least by themselves, say anything about this creator being all-powerful or all good, or one who even cares, or one who even knows about humans. Christianity, however, not only makes a claim that God is the first cause and that this God is our master designer, it also goes on to make the claim that our alleged creator is also omnipotent and benign, and greatly cares for all his creation. So this, at the very least, calls for some explanations for the existence of suffering. Whereas when it comes to the remote deist type of belief in God, or say polytheistic beliefs in gods that aren't all-powerful or all good, suffering presents no paradox at all. Because deists and polytheists can always say, well, suffering exists because the gods aren't powerful enough to stop it, or the gods aren't good, or the gods don't care. Now I need to make one more language distinction. Epydemic usually talks about the problem of evil, whereas I always talk about the problem of suffering. And that's because I see the problem of suffering as the much more challenging one for the Christian. Because if we restrict our language to talking about the problem of evil, Theists can always just say that an all-good God would give people free will, and once people have free will, they'll abuse it and cause evil. The problem of suffering, on the other hand, is more challenging because it includes suffering that has nothing to do with free will. It asks questions like, why would a purposeful and loving creator design the Earth's surface out of giant plates and make the Earth's core so incredibly hot that these plates will be in slow but steady motion so that earthquakes will be inevitable? It also asks questions like, why did our loving master creator design life to prey upon life, and often in gruesome ways? Why did God design the jawless lamprey fish with a suction cup mouth that fastens onto larger fish, and give the lamprey sharp teeth on its tongue so it can scrape holes into their victims and suck their blood, and then leave a resulting hole in the host fish's side so large that it will bleed to death after the lamprey's meal is over? Now, these are the types of questions that get bypassed when we limit our language to just discussing the problem of evil. Because I don't think anyone could say that predators are evil, but I believe it's evident enough that nature's setup of life needing to prey upon life does cause creature suffering. Now, I raised this point in my first video to Epydemic by asking why a loving, purposeful God would sentence most gazelles by their very design to suffer through the terrifying and incredible painful death of being eaten alive by the likes of a pack of hyenas. Epydemic's response was that, well, if atheism considers wildlife predation to be morally neutral, isn't it special pleading to say that predation is evil if theism is true? And I responded in his comment section that wildlife suffering is morally neutral in the atheist worldview because if natural selection is responsible, that means there was no intention for suffering. That's just the way life evolved. There was no master planner in control. But if you're saying that all life was designed by a master designer, then it's reasonable to at least ask why this master designer felt it necessary to make creature suffering a built-in part of his grand scheme. And I went on to make the analogy about a puppy being crushed by a boulder rolling down a hill. If the boulder's movement was caused by gravity, well, that's analogous to natural selection because there was no intention. If the boulder had been aimed and pushed toward the puppy, that's analogous to the purposeful creation model. There was full intention for that creature suffering. Epydemic, in turn, responded that a puppy being crushed by a boulder wasn't necessarily evil because, well, what if the puppy had rabies and is about to bite a baby? And to that I answer, okay, fair enough. If the puppy was rabid and about to bite a baby, crushing that puppy by throwing a boulder on it, well, that explains why a benign force might cause suffering, and that's because the end result is the greater good. But my point remains that this is not special pleading. Things like gravity and natural selection are morally neutral because when they cause pain, there's no intent. There's no intelligent force causing that pain. It would be ridiculous to ask, why is gravity so heartless? But if a God really created everything, that means there was an intent when it came to the design of the hyena's jaws, and a purposeful intent behind the hyena's feeding method of tearing apart prey like antelope by ripping holes in their throats or disembowelment. If a God really created everything, that means this God consciously designed the lamprey with sharp teeth, sharp teeth on its tongue, so it could feed by boring large holes into its victims. And this creator designed mosquitoes and created them in a way that they would be carriers of the malaria that causes over 1 million young children every year to suffer through chills, then vomiting, coma, and death. Now, as I see it, these kinds of observations of nature are damaging to the credibility of the belief that this setup was the design of a loving, all-powerful deity. But I am certainly interested in hearing explanations for why people believe nature is completely compatible with the idea of a loving, omnipotent creator. So I'll get to my analysis of Epydemic's explanations in part 2.